The morning of October 25, 1944, began with the kind of deceptive calm that precedes catastrophe. Commander Ernest E. Evans stood on the bridge of the USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer cutting through the Philippine Sea east of Samar Island. The pre-dawn darkness had just given way to grey light when the lookout's voice shattered the stillness. Ships on the horizon, bearing north. Multiple contacts. They're big. Evans raised his binoculars. What he saw should not have been possible. The pagoda-style masts rising from the horizon belonged to Japanese battleships vessels that, according to every intelligence report, every strategic assessment, every prayer of the men aboard the escort carriers behind him, should have been anywhere but here. Yet there they were. Yamato, Kongo, Haruna, Nagato, 4 of the most powerful warships ever constructed, accompanied by heavy cruisers and destroyers, steamed directly toward the thin-skinned escort carriers of Taffy 3 that Johnston had been assigned to protect. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. Johnston displaced 2,100 tons and carried 5 5-inch guns. Yamato alone displaced 72,000 tons and mounted 9 18-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever put to sea. Each of Yamato's main battery shells weighed more than an automobile. One hit would vaporize Johnston. The logical response was to lay smoke, fall back, and pray the carriers could launch aircraft before the Japanese closed the distance. Evans turned to his crew. His next words, recorded in multiple survivor accounts, would define everything that followed. A large Japanese fleet has been sighted. They are 15 miles away and headed in our direction. They are believed to have 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and a number of destroyers. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand the profound irony of what happened next, how a single destroyer would charge directly at a battle fleet, you must first understand Ernest Evans and the peculiar culture of the American destroyer service in World War II. Evans was Cherokee, born in Oklahoma in 1908, a fact he wore with fierce pride. At his commissioning speech when Johnston entered service in October 1943, he had told his crew something that seemed like bluster at the time. "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." It wasn't bluster. It was doctrine. American destroyer doctrine in 1944 rested on a principle that seemed suicidal on paper. The destroyer's purpose was to attack, not to defend, not to screen, to attack. The destroyer force had been conceived as a strike weapon fast enough to close with the enemy, heavily armed enough with torpedoes to cripple capital ships, and expendable enough that their loss was considered an acceptable trade for damaging an enemy battleship or carrier. The 5-inch guns were almost secondary. The real weapons were the 10 Mark 15 torpedoes in the centerline mounts, each carrying 668 pounds of Torpex explosive and capable of breaking a cruiser's keel. But doctrine assumed you'd be attacking as part of a coordinated force, with battleships and cruisers providing covering fire. Doctrine assumed you'd have support. The situation off Samar that morning bore no resemblance to doctrine. To fully grasp the impossibility of what Evans was contemplating, consider the specific vessels bearing down on his position. Yamato, the flagship of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, was the largest battleship ever built. Her main belt armor was 16 inches thick, thicker than Johnston's entire hull. Her 9 18-inch guns could hurl a 3,200-pound shell over 25 miles. She had been designed for exactly one purpose: to sink American battleships in a decisive surface engagement. Behind Yamato came Nagato, a veteran of the Pearl Harbor attack force, mounting 8 16-inch guns. Kongo and Haruna, battle cruisers reclassified as fast battleships, each carried 8 14-inch guns and could make 30 knots. Accompanying these leviathans were 6 heavy cruisers: Haguro, Chokai, Kumano, Suzuya, Chikuma, and Tone, each mounting 8 or 10 8-inch guns. 2 light cruisers and 11 destroyers completed the formation. In total, Kurita commanded 23 warships, mounting more than 200 heavy guns. Defending against this armada, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts of Taffy 3. The escort carriers Fanshawe Bay, Streetlow, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kitkun Bay, and Gambia Bay were converted merchant hulls with wooden flight decks. They'd been designed to transport aircraft and hunt submarines, not fight surface actions. Their single 5-inch gun was mounted at the stern, useful only when running away. Their maximum speed was 17 knots, slow enough that Kurita's battleships could overtake them within 2 hours. The carriers carried aircraft, yes, but most were loaded for ground support missions against Japanese positions on Leyte. They carried bombs and rockets, not armor-piercing torpedoes. The pilots would have to attack battleships with weapons designed to destroy trucks and bunkers. This left the destroyers and destroyer escorts as the only vessels capable of fighting back with any hope of effect. Johnston, Howell, and Heermann were Fletcher-class destroyers. Samuel B., Roberts, Dennis, John C., Butler, and Raymond were destroyer escorts, smaller, slower, more lightly armed. Against Kurita's force, they were gnats attacking elephants. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had been unfolding for 3 days. Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet had been lured north by a Japanese decoy force, leaving the invasion beaches at Leyte Gulf protected only by escort carrier groups and their destroyer screens. Kurita's center force had been battered by submarine attacks and airstrikes while transiting the Sibuyan Sea, losing the super battleship Musashi Yamato's sister ship to repeated bomb and torpedo hits. American commanders believed Kurita had turned back. He hadn't. Instead, he'd made a night transit through San Bernardino Strait and emerged at dawn off Samar, positioned perfectly to fall upon the escort carriers from the north. The escort carriers of Taffy 3, under Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, had been launching routine air patrols when Kurita's force appeared. Sprague's first reaction, recorded in the action reports, was disbelief. His radio message to higher command captured the surreal horror of the moment. Enemy surface force of 4 battleships, 7 cruisers, and 11 destroyers sighted 20 miles northwest of this unit, and closing. The response from Admiral Thomas Kincaid, commanding 7th Fleet, reflected equal shock. Attack, repeat, attack. Attack with what? Sprague's carriers couldn't outrun Kurita's battleships. His aircraft couldn't rearm with appropriate weapons in time. His destroyers were outgunned by ratios that beggar description. The only option was to run south, toward Leyte Gulf, and hope that Kurita would be delayed long enough for Halsey to realize his error and return, or for land-based aircraft to intervene. This is where Ernest Evans made his decision. Standing on Johnston's bridge, watching the Japanese formation resolve from indistinct shapes into identifiable warships, he could have maintained position in the screen, laying smoke to cover the carrier's retreat. He could have waited for orders from Sprague. He could have done what every survival instinct, every rational calculation screamed at him to do. Instead, he ordered flank speed. Commence firing! Johnston surged forward, alone, directly toward the Japanese battle line. Her boilers, pushed to emergency power, drove her to 35 knots. Her 5-inch guns opened fire at a range of 18,000 yards, 9 miles far beyond their effective range, but close enough that the Japanese would see the shell splashes and recognize they were under attack. Evans was charging 4 battleships and 6 heavy cruisers, with a destroyer that weighed less than one of Yamato's turrets. The decision violated every principle of naval warfare except one, the principle that had been hammered into American destroyer commanders since the service's inception. When the enemy threatens your carriers, you attack. You don't calculate odds. You don't wait for support. You attack with everything you have, immediately, because every second of delay is another second the enemy closes on the carriers, and the carriers cannot defend themselves. But there was something else driving Evans's decision, something documented in the accounts of survivors who served under him. Evans had told his crew, repeatedly, that Johnston's purpose was to fight. He had trained them for exactly this moment, the moment when the logical action was retreat and the necessary action was attacked. He had cultivated in them the belief that a destroyer's honor lay not in preservation but in commitment. When the moment came, retreat was literally unthinkable. The range closed rapidly. At 35 knots, Johnston was covering 1,100 yards per minute. The Japanese formation, steaming south at 25 knots, closed at similar speed. Every minute brought the forces 2,000 yards closer together. At this rate of closure, Johnston would be in effective torpedo range 10,000 yards in less than 4 minutes. Johnston's 5-inch guns continued firing, the reports echoing across the water. The shells, at this extreme range, arced high into the sky before plunging down toward the Japanese ships. The Japanese responded. First, the cruisers opened fire. 8-inch shells began falling around Johnston, raising towering columns of water. Then the battleships joined in. The sound of 16-inch and 18-inch guns firing is difficult to describe to anyone who hasn't experienced it. Survivors from Taffy 3 recalled the shock waves traveling across the water, hitting their ships like physical blows seconds before the shells arrived. Evans maneuvered Johnston through the shell splashes, zigzagging to throw off the Japanese gunners' aim, but zigzagging reduced speed, and speed was everything. He needed to close to torpedo range before the accumulated damage from near misses shredded Johnston's thin hull. The destroyer's armour, if it could be called that, consisted of half an inch of special treatment steel around the magazines and machinery, spaces. It would stop shell fragments. It would not stop an 8-inch shell, much less a 16-inch shell. At 07:20 hours, 17 minutes after commencing the attack, Johnston reached torpedo range. Evans ordered, "Fire torpedoes." All 10 Mark 15 torpedoes launched in rapid succession, their propellers churning the water as they accelerated to 46 knots. The spread targeted the lead cruiser column Kumano, Suzuya, Chikuma, and Chokai. At 10,000 yards, the torpedoes would take nearly 5 minutes to reach their targets. 5 minutes during which Johnston remained fully exposed to the entire Japanese battle line. Evans turned Johnston hard to port, presenting the smallest target profile while his guns continued to fire. The forward 5-inch mounts targeted the cruisers. The aft mounts targeted the battleships, less for hope of doing damage than to distract their gunners, to make them pay attention to Johnston instead of the carriers. At 07:24 hours, 4 minutes after Johnston's torpedoes launched, a violent explosion erupted amidst the Japanese cruiser column. Kumano, the lead heavy cruiser, staggered as a Mark 15 torpedo struck her bow. The explosion tore away 40 feet of her forward structure, including the number 1 turret. Kumano's speed dropped to 16 knots as she struggled to control flooding. She turned away from the formation, effectively out of the battle. 1 torpedo hit, 1 cruiser crippled. The trade was not yet complete. The Japanese concentrated their fire on Johnston. What had been scattered salvos became a deluge. Shells of every caliber, 8-inch, 14-inch, 16-inch, walked across the water toward the destroyer. Evans kept maneuvering, but the odds had always been insurmountable. At 07:30 hours, 30 minutes into the engagement, Johnston took her first serious hit. A 14-inch shell from either Congo or Haruna struck Johnston's bridge. The projectile, designed to penetrate battleship armor, passed completely through the destroyer's light structure before detonating. The explosion killed or wounded most of the bridge crew instantly. Evans was blown across the compartment. When he regained consciousness, his left hand was gone, severed above the wrist. Shrapnel had torn through his abdomen and chest. Blood covered the deck. The bridge was a ruin of twisted metal and shattered equipment. The primary steering control was destroyed. Communications with the rest of the ship were severed. Fire raged through the forward superstructure. Any other commander would have ordered an abandoned ship. The destroyer had done its job, crippled a cruiser, distracted the Japanese formation, and bought the carrier precious minutes. Evans wrapped his mutilated arm in a rag torn from someone's shirt. He dragged himself to his feet using the remains of the compass pedestal. His next words, according to Lieutenant Robert Hagan, survived the war and testified about this moment, were delivered in a voice loud enough to cut through the chaos. "Steer her from after steering. We're still in this fight." Johnston's crew shifted control to the emergency steering position in the stern. The destroyer, burning and holed, but with her engines still running and her guns still firing, turned back into the fight. This was no longer about tactical doctrine or strategic necessity. This had become something else entirely, a demonstration that Johnston would not yield, would not withdraw, would not be driven from the battle by any amount of damage short of sinking. Evans, bleeding heavily and in shock from his wounds, made his way aft through smoke-filled passageways to the secondary conning position. From there, he continued to direct Johnston's fire. The forward 5-inch mounts were still operational, the torpedoes were expended, but the guns could still shoot, and the engines could still drive the ship. So Johnston continued to fight. Over the next hour, Johnston engaged every Japanese ship that came within range. She fired at cruisers. She fired at battleships. She maneuvered to position herself between the Japanese and the escort carriers, forcing Kurita's ships to either engage the destroyer or sail around her. Every minute Johnston remained in action was another minute the carriers drew farther south, another minute for their aircraft to rearm and launch strikes, another minute closer to potential reinforcement. The Japanese were baffled. The action reports from surviving officers of Kurita's force, recovered after the war, revealed genuine confusion about what they were facing. They had identified Johnston as a destroyer. The Americans' aggressive attack and torpedo launch made that clear. But her continued presence in the battle line, even after absorbing damage that should have sunk her, led some Japanese officers to initially mistake her for a light cruiser. No destroyer, they reasoned, would continue fighting after such punishment. They were wrong. Johnston was doing exactly what she'd been built to do, pushed to the absolute limit of the concept. The American destroyer doctrine attack, always attack, had found its purest expression in the waters off Samar. At 0830 hours, 1 hour after the battle began, Johnston's engineering spaces took a catastrophic hit. Shell accounts vary on caliber, but likely 8-inch from one of the pursuing cruisers penetrated the aft engine room. The explosion killed everyone in the compartment instantly and destroyed the propulsion plant. Johnston's speed dropped from 28 knots to 17 knots, then to 10 knots, then to death in the water. Without propulsion, without the ability to maneuver, Johnston was finished. The Japanese closed in. Destroyers from Kurita's screen, no longer concerned about torpedo attack, moved in to finish off the crippled American vessel. At 0910 hours, Commander Evans gave the order he had delayed as long as physically possible. Abandon ship. The crew began going over the side. Many were wounded. Johnston carried no life rafts, they'd been blown away in the earlier hits. The men went into the water with life jackets and whatever debris they could find to cling to. The sea was covered with oil from Johnston's ruptured fuel bunkers. Men struggled to swim away from the sinking destroyer through the viscous slick. Evans remained aboard. Multiple survivors testified that they saw him on the deck as they went over the side, still giving orders, still directing the evacuation. He refused assistance. His wounds were clearly mortal, he'd lost tremendous amounts of blood over the past hour, and the shrapnel damage to his torso was far beyond what could be treated even in a fully equipped hospital. But he remained conscious and in command until the end. At 0945 hours, Johnston rolled to port and sank by the stern. She went down with her battle flags still flying, her forward guns trained toward the enemy. Of her complement of 327 officers and men, 186 went down with the ship or died in the water afterward. 141 survived to be rescued days later by American forces. Commander Ernest E. Evans was not among the survivors. Multiple witnesses reported seeing him in the water initially, but he disappeared within minutes of Johnston's sinking. His body was never recovered. In 1947, he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American in the Navy to receive the decoration. The citation read, in part, "Outgunned and outmaneuvered by the enemy, Commander Evans's courage and determination instilled confidence and fortitude in his men, but Johnston's sacrifice and Evans' death were not meaningless gestures. While Johnston charged alone, the other destroyers and destroyer escorts of Taffy 3's screen watched and understood what was required of them. 3 minutes after Johnston began her attack, Commander William Thomas aboard USS Hull ordered his destroyer into the attack. 5 minutes later, Commander Amos Hathaway aboard USS Heerman followed. The destroyer escorts, smaller, slower, more lightly armed, charged as well. Samuel B., Roberts, Dennis, John C., Butler, and Raymond threw themselves at the Japanese formation. The collective effect was devastating, not in terms of ships sunk, but in terms of tactical disruption. Kurita's formation dissolved as individual ships maneuvered to avoid torpedoes and engage the attacking destroyers. The concentrated striking power of his force fragmented into individual ship actions. His battleships, which should have been pounding the escort carriers into scrap, instead found themselves firing at destroyers that refused to die. The escort carriers' aircraft, meanwhile, rearmed with whatever weapons were available and launched continuous strikes. Avengers carrying depth charges attacked battleships. Wildcats strafed cruiser bridges with 50 caliber machine guns. Some pilots, having expended all ammunition, made dummy runs to distract Japanese gunners. The cumulative effect, destroyers charging, aircraft swarming, smoke obscuring visibility, created an impression of a much larger American force. At 09:20 hours, 90 minutes into the battle, Kurita ordered his forces to cease pursuit and regroup. The decision remains controversial among naval historians. Kurita's force still possessed overwhelming firepower. Only one escort carrier, Gambier Bay, had been sunk. The other carriers were damaged but still afloat. Yet Kurita broke off the attack, convinced he was facing a much larger force and concerned about air attacks from what he believed were fleet carriers rather than escort carriers. The truth was simpler and more profound. The destroyers of Taffy 3, led by Johnston's suicidal charge, had so thoroughly disrupted Kurita's formation and so convincingly demonstrated their willingness to die fighting, that Kurita concluded he was facing the kind of desperate last stand that only accompanies a major American fleet unit. The performance was so far beyond what any reasonable commander would expect from escort carriers and destroyers that it created the illusion of strength where none existed. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. In the immediate aftermath, as American forces swept the area for survivors, the full scope of what had transpired began to emerge. Taffy 3 had lost 2 escort carriers, Gambier Bay, to surface gunfire and street, low to a kamikaze attack after the surface battle ended. 2 destroyers, Johnston and Hull, had been sunk. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts had gone down fighting, having taken over 90 direct hits before capsizing. Most of the surviving ships were severely damaged. Yet Kurita's center force, which had begun the battle with the power to annihilate every American vessel in the area, had withdrawn with the mission unfulfilled. The transports and supply ships at Leyte Gulf remained untouched. The invasion proceeded. The strategic objective, preventing Kurita from disrupting the Leyte landings, had been achieved at terrible cost. The question that haunted American commanders afterward was simple. How? How had 6 escort carriers and 7 destroyers held off 23 warships, including 4 battleships? The official action reports, compiled in the weeks following the battle, struggled to provide an answer that made tactical sense. Admiral Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, wrote in his after-action report, "The failure of the enemy to completely wipe out all vessels of this task unit can be attributed to our successful smokescreen, our torpedo counterattack, continuous harassment of enemy by bomb, torpedo, and strafing air, attacks, timely maneuvers, and the definite partiality of Almighty God." But buried in the individual ship action reports was another explanation. USS Johnston's report, filed by the surviving executive officer after his rescue, contained a single line that captured something essential. Commander Evans' decision to immediately engage independently, before coordinated attack could be arranged, provided the critical initial disruption that made all subsequent actions possible. Johnston's charge, seemingly suicidal, apparently wasteful, tactically indefensible, had accomplished something profound. By attacking first, before the Japanese could settle into an organized pursuit, Evans had seized the initiative. His willingness to die had forced Kurita to pay attention to threats in his midst rather than focusing on the fleeing carriers. In the precious minutes, while Japanese ships maneuvered to engage Johnston, the carriers opened the range. When the other destroyers joined the attack, they entered a battle space already in chaos, where the Japanese were reacting rather than executing a plan. The mathematical analysis done by naval staff officers after the war revealed the scope of this achievement. Had Kurita maintained formation and pursued the carriers directly, his battleships would have closed to effective gunnery range within 40 minutes. The carrier's maximum speed of 17 knots could not outrun the battleship's 25 to 30 knots. Simple mathematics suggested all 6 carriers should have been sunk within 90 minutes. Instead, the battle lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes, and 4 carriers survived. The time difference over an hour was directly attributable to the destroyer's attack, forcing Kurita's ships to maneuver defensively, firing at attacking destroyers rather than fleeing carriers. Of that hour gained, the first 20 minutes came while Johnston fought alone, before the coordinated destroyer attack developed. 20 minutes. Doesn't sound like much. But in those 20 minutes, the carriers travelled 5 miles, farther south. Their aircraft launched, rearmed, and returned to the attack. The Japanese formation dissolved from a coordinated pursuit into individual ship actions. The entire tactical picture transformed from certain American defeat to possible survival. Johnston's crew paid for those 20 minutes with their lives. 186 men, led by a Cherokee commander who had promised them this would be a fighting ship, had made good on that promise in the most complete way imaginable. The survivors, rescued 3 days later after floating in oil-covered waters through multiple shark attacks and tropical heat, carried with them the memory of those final moments. Robert Hagan, Johnston's gunnery officer, testified during the Medal of Honor investigation that Evans' last words to him, spoken as Evans wrapped his severed hand and prepared to continue fighting, were, "We've done our job. Now we finish it." The phrase entered destroyer force legend. Finish it became shorthand for a particular kind of commitment, the understanding that once you began an attack, you carried it through regardless of cost. Destroyer squadrons adopted it as an unofficial motto. It appeared painted on ready rooms and etched into plaques. For the men of the destroyer force, it captured something essential about what had happened off Samar. But there was another legacy, one that took longer to emerge. In the years immediately after the war, as the Navy analysed the battle off Samar, a debate developed about destroyer doctrine. Had Johnston's charge been heroic but wasteful? Should Evans have waited for coordinated attack? Should he have maintained his screening position and relied on smoke and manoeuvre rather than direct assault? The debate resolved as more information about Kurita's decision-making emerged. Post-war interrogations of surviving Japanese officers revealed that the appearance of American destroyers charging his formation had caused immediate concern at the command level. The Japanese had been trained, like the Americans, that destroyers attacked as part of coordinated plans. The appearance of a destroyer charging alone suggested either desperation or the presence of supporting forces not yet visible. Kurita had assumed the latter. He'd concluded the escort carriers were actually fleet carriers, and the attacking destroyers were the van of a much larger force. Had Johnston maintained position, had the destroyers attacked in carefully coordinated formation, Kurita would have recognized exactly what he was facing, a token force buying time. The apparently reckless aggression of Johnston's solo charge created the illusion of strength because no commander would throw away a destroyer unless he had more destroyers to spend. This realization that apparent recklessness had created strategic effect fundamentally altered destroyer doctrine. Post-war training emphasized that the willingness to accept certain destruction, visibly demonstrated, could achieve effects beyond the physical damage inflicted. The psychological impact of watching a destroyer charge battleships, knowing it would be destroyed, created hesitation and caution in enemy commanders. That hesitation was a weapon in itself. Johnston's action became the case study. Every destroyer officer studied the battle. The question was never, should Evans have been charged? But rather, how did Evans know that charging alone would be more effective than waiting? The answer, uncomfortable to staff officers who believed war could be reduced to calculations, was that Evans didn't know. He'd attacked because attack was his purpose, and the strategic effect emerged from that purity of commitment rather than from calculated planning. The implications were profound. Modern naval warfare, by 1944, had supposedly evolved beyond the age of individual heroism. Battles were won by radar, by fire control computers, by coordinated task force operations. The idea that a single ship commander's decision made in seconds, based on instinct rather than analysis, could alter the outcome of a strategic battle seemed anachronistic. Yet that's exactly what had happened. Commander Ernest Evans, Cherokee warrior from Oklahoma, destroyer commander who'd promised his crew they'd see combat, had decided in an instant to charge 4 battleships. That decision, multiplied by his crew's execution and the other destroyers' willingness to follow his example, had saved an amphibious invasion and possibly altered the timeline of the Pacific War's conclusion. The cost had been terrible. The moral question whether any commander has the right to order men into certain death haunted naval officers for years afterward. Evans had known Johnston would be destroyed. He'd stated it explicitly. Survival cannot be expected. Yet he'd ordered the attack, and his crew had followed. Was that leadership or murder? The survivors provided the answer. In testimony after testimony, in interviews conducted decades after the war, the men of Johnston expressed not bitterness, but pride. They'd understood what was required. They'd known the odds. They'd charged anyway because that's what destroyers do, and they'd been on a destroyer that lived up to its purpose more completely than any other vessel in the war. Robert Billy, a gunner's mate who survived, said in a 1990 interview, "We knew we were going to die, but we also knew those carriers had to get away." That's the trade. That's always been the trade. You don't think about it. You just do your job. That phrase, "just do your job," captured something essential about how ordinary men accomplished extraordinary things. They hadn't transformed into heroes. They'd remained sailors doing their assigned tasks, following their training, executing their duties. The heroism emerged from the completeness of that dedication, not from transcending it. The destruction of Johnston was not an isolated sacrifice. While Evans' destroyer fought and died, the rest of Taffy 3's screen followed her into battle, each vessel writing its own chapter in what would become known as the most desperate surface action in U.S. naval history. USS Hull, commanded by Commander William Dow Thomas, commenced her attack 3 minutes after Johnston. Thomas had watched Evans charge alone and understood immediately what was required. Hull carried the same complement of Mark 15 torpedoes as Johnston 10 fish, capable of crippling a cruiser or damaging a battleship. But to get those torpedoes into effective range meant closing to within 10,000 yards of ships that could destroy Hull with a single salvo. Thomas didn't hesitate. At 07:23 hours, Hull turned out of the smoke screen and accelerated to flank speed, heading directly toward the Japanese battle line. Her target was the battleship, Congo, steaming at the head of the formation. The approach took 12 minutes of running through shell splashes as every Japanese ship within range opened fire on the attacking destroyer. At 07:35 hours, Hull launched her first spread of 5 torpedoes at Congo from 9,000 yards. The battleship turned hard to starboard to comb the tracks, maneuvering to present the narrowest target profile. The torpedoes missed, passing down Congo's starboard side. But the maneuver disrupted Congo's pursuit of the carriers, forcing the battleship to temporarily break formation. Hull didn't withdraw. She had 5 torpedoes remaining and multiple targets. Commander Thomas maneuvered to attack the heavy cruiser column Haguro leading Tone and Chikuma. At 0742 hours, Hull launched her remaining torpedoes at 7,000 yards. At this range, the heavy cruiser's 8-inch guns were firing in nearly flat trajectory, the shells arriving, seconds after firing. One torpedo struck Haguro amidships, the explosion tearing a 40-foot hole in her hull below the waterline. Haguro's speed dropped to 22 knots, as damage control parties struggled to contain flooding. Like Kumano earlier, Haguro remained combat-capable, but could no longer maintain position with the main formation. 2 cruisers crippled, 2 destroyers committed to the attack. The exchange rate was devastating for the Americans in terms of tonnage, but the tactical effect was exactly what Sprague needed: disruption, delay, confusion in the Japanese ranks. Hull paid immediately for her success. With her torpedoes expended, she became a target rather than a threat. The Japanese concentrated fire on the destroyer, and at ranges under 8,000 yards, even near misses caused catastrophic damage. At 0805 hours, a 14-inch shell from either Congo or Haruna struck Hull's bridge, killing Commander Thomas and most of his command staff, instantly. The surviving officers shifted control to the secondary conning position, just as Johnston had done. Hull continued to fight, her 5-inch guns firing at any Japanese ship within range, but the damage was accumulating faster than repair parties could manage. Hits in the forward engine room reduced speed. Hits on the forward gun mounts silenced 3 of her 5 main battery guns. Fire spread through the superstructure. At 0830 hours, the same time Johnston's engineering spaces were destroyed, Hull took a catastrophic hit in her aft magazines. The secondary explosion tore away her entire stern section. The destroyer rolled onto her port side and began to sink rapidly. The crew abandoned ship at 0840 hours. Hull went down 10 minutes later, taking 253 officers and men with her. Only 86 survived. USS Heermann, the third destroyer in Taffy 3's screen, attacked under circumstances slightly different from Johnston, Hull. Commander Amos Hathaway had time to observe the Japanese formation and plan his approach. Where Evans and Thomas had charged directly at the nearest heavy units, Hathaway maneuvered Heermann to attack from the flank, aiming to cross the Japanese formation's bow and deliver torpedoes at near-perfect 90-degree angles. The maneuver required extraordinary ship handling. Heermann had to thread between friendly and enemy vessels while under fire from multiple Japanese ships, timing her approach to hit the optimal firing position. At 0754 hours, Heermann achieved position and launched all 10 torpedoes in a spread targeting the battleships Haruna and Congo. No hits were recorded, but the torpedo tracks forced both battleships to maneuver violently, again disrupting the formation. More critically, Heermann's aggressive approach brought her to within 5,000 yards of Haruna point-blank range for battleship guns. The 14-inch shells arrived in salvos that straddled Heermann, the shell splashes rising higher than the destroyer's masts. Hathaway threw Heermann into a series of desperate maneuvers, turning so sharply that the destroyer heeled over 40 degrees, her starboard rail nearly awash. Multiple accounts from Japanese ships recorded the American destroyer's violent evasions. One Japanese officer, quoted in post-war interrogations, stated, "The American destroyer captain handled his ship with such skill that we could not achieve a hit despite firing more than 30 salvos." Heermann survived through a combination of Hathaway's ship handling and sheer chance. Near misses riddled her hull with shrapnel. Her after gun mount was destroyed by a hit that killed the entire gun crew but failed to detonate. A 14-inch shell passed completely through her bow without exploding. Had it detonated, Heermann would have disintegrated. Despite the damage, Heermann remained in action throughout the battle, positioning herself between the carriers and pursuing Japanese ships, laying smoke and firing her remaining guns at any target within range. When the battle ended, Heermann had expended all torpedoes, fired over 600 rounds of 5-inch ammunition, and survived more than 40 near misses from heavy-caliber shells. She was the only destroyer of Taffy 3's screen to survive the surface action. But the destroyers did not fight alone. The destroyer escorts smaller vessels displacing only 1,400 tons and armed with only two 5-inch guns charged into battle alongside their larger cousins, USS Samuel B. Roberts, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, epitomized the destroyer escort's sacrifice. Roberts displaced barely 1/3 of a Fletcher-class destroyer's tonnage and carried a fraction of the firepower. Her maximum speed was 24 knots, slow enough that Japanese battleships could overtake her with ease. She carried only 3 torpedoes, compared to the destroyer's 10. Yet when Copeland received Sprague's order to attack, he responded with the same commitment as Evans and Thomas. At 08:51 hours, Roberts commenced her attack run. She closed to within 4,000 yards of the heavy cruiser Chokai before launching her 3 torpedoes. At least one struck home. Chokai's steering was damaged, forcing her to withdraw from the battle. Roberts then engaged Chokai with her 5-inch guns at ranges under 6,000 yards. The destroyer escort's gun crews achieved what naval historians later calculated was the highest rate of accurate fire of any American ship in the battle. Roberts' guns fired over 600 rounds in the next hour, scoring multiple hits on Chokai and contributing to damage that eventually forced the cruiser's abandonment. The Japanese response was overwhelming. Roberts took hit after hit from 8-inch and 14-inch shells. Her thin hull, designed to protect against submarine attack rather than surface gunfire, provided virtually no protection. Shells passed completely through the ship before exploding on the far side. Others detonated within the hull, gutting entire compartments. At 09:35 hours, Roberts' forward engine room was destroyed by a shell that killed all personnel inside instantly. Speed dropped to dead slow. At 09:45 hours, a 14-inch shell struck the aft magazines. The explosion broke Roberts' keel. The destroyer escort jackknifed, her bow and stern rising as the middle section flooded and sank. The crew abandoned ship, but many were trapped below decks or too badly wounded to escape. Roberts sank at 10:05 hours, taking 90 men with her. The survivors floated in oil-covered water for 50 hours before rescue. Many died from wounds, exposure, or shark attack during those 2 days. The other destroyer escorts Dennis, John C., Butler, and Raymond survived the battle but not unscathed. Each took damage from near misses and shell fragments. Each expended all torpedoes and most ammunition. Each positioned herself between the carriers and Japanese ships, accepting damage to protect the more valuable vessels. The cumulative effect of these attacks, 7 warships charging 23, accepting certain destruction to buy time, created the tactical chaos that saved the Taffy 3. But there was another element to the defense that proved equally critical: the aircraft. The escort carrier's primary function was ground support and anti-submarine patrol. Their squadrons, composite units combining fighters and torpedo bombers, were not equipped for attacking capital ships. Most aircraft that morning had been armed with rockets and small bombs for attacking Japanese positions on Leyte. The torpedoes in the carrier's magazines were Mark 13 aerial torpedoes designed for anti-submarine work, with warheads too small to seriously damage battleships. Yet when the Japanese fleet appeared, the pilots launched with whatever weapons they carried and attacked regardless of effectiveness. Wildcats strafed battleship superstructures with 50 caliber machine guns, weapons utterly incapable of penetrating armored hulls, but capable of killing exposed personnel and damaging fire control equipment. Avengers dropped depth charges set for shallow detonation, hoping the underwater explosions would damage propeller shafts or rudders. Some pilots, having expended all ordnance, made dry runs over Japanese ships to distract anti-aircraft gunners and disrupt fire control solutions. The aircraft attacks, like the destroyer charges, achieved effect beyond their physical damage. Japanese ships maneuvered constantly to avoid air attacks, breaking formation and losing speed. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, creating additional visual obscuration beyond the smokescreen. Japanese commanders had to divide their attention between the surface threat from destroyers and the aerial threat from AIM aircraft, preventing the kind of focused pursuit that would have overtaken the carriers. Lieutenant Commander Edward Huxtable, commanding Composite Squadron 10 from USS Gambier Bay, led repeated strikes against the Japanese formation, despite flying an Avenger loaded only with depth charges. His after-action report, filed after his rescue, described the situation with stark clarity. "We attacked with whatever we had because doing nothing was not an option. The destroyers were dying to buy us time. We had to use that time, even if our weapons were inadequate." Huxtable's Avenger was shot down on his third attack run. He survived the ditching and was rescued by submarine 2 days later. Of the aircraft that launched from Taffy 3's carriers during the battle, 37 were shot down or damaged beyond repair. 17 pilots and aircrew were killed, yet their sacrifice, combined with the destroyer's attacks, achieved the impossible. At 09:20 hours, Vice Admiral Kurita ordered his forces to cease pursuit and regroup. The decision remains one of the most debated in naval history. Kurita's official report, filed after the battle, cited several factors: concern about air attacks from what he believed were fleet carriers, confusion about the composition of American forces, damage to several of his cruisers from torpedo hits, and the aggressive nature of the American defense, suggesting the presence of stronger forces nearby. Post-war interrogations revealed additional considerations. Kurita had lost the super battleship Musashi the previous day to air attack. He'd seen his formation torn apart by what he initially believed were light forces. The appearance of destroyers charging his battleships suggested to him that he was facing a last-ditch defense of a major fleet unit, not an escort carrier group. The ferocity of the defense convinced him he was walking into a trap. In reality, Kurita faced no trap. The carriers he'd been pursuing were escort carriers, not fleet carriers. The destroyers that attacked him represented nearly the entirety of Taffy 3's surface combat power. The aircraft striking his ships were armed with inadequate weapons and running out of fuel. Had he continued the pursuit, he almost certainly would have sunk all 6 carriers within another hour. But he didn't know that. The performance of Johnston, Hull, Roberts, and the other American ships had been so far beyond what Kurita expected from escort units that it created the illusion of strength. The American willingness to die fighting suggested forces worth dying for fleet carriers, battleships, cruisers must be nearby. This was the profound irony at the heart of the battle off Samar. The weakest American naval force in the Philippine Sea, 6 escort carriers and 7 escorts had defeated the strongest Japanese surface force, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, not through superior firepower or technology, but through willingness to accept annihilation. The casualties reflected this willingness. Taffy 3 lost 1,583 men killed in action, most from the destroyers and destroyer escorts. USS Johnston, 186 dead. USS Hull, 253 dead. USS Samuel B. Roberts, 90 dead. USS Gambier Bay, sunk by gunfire after the destroyer's attacks, over 800 dead. The Japanese losses in sunk ships were minimal: 3 heavy cruisers damaged severely enough to withdraw, no battleships seriously damaged. But Kurita's force never again posed a strategic threat. The center force withdrew through San Bernardino Strait that evening and retreated toward Brunei. The opportunity to disrupt the later landings, the entire strategic purpose of the operation had been lost. The question haunted Japanese naval officers for the rest of their lives. How had they failed? They'd possessed overwhelming superiority. They'd achieved complete surprise. They'd engaged at ranges where their guns were vastly superior, yet they'd been turned back by forces they should have annihilated in 30 minutes. Admiral Matome Ugaki, commanding Battleship Division 1, which included Yamato, wrote in his diary that evening, "The enemy's fierce resistance and skillful use of smoke prevented the decisive results we sought. Their small ships attacked with a determination that suggested the presence of their main fleet. We could not understand why escort vessels would sacrifice themselves so completely unless protecting forces of great value." The answer, invisible to Ugaki and his colleagues, was that the forces of great value were the destroyers themselves. Not what they protected, but what they represented. The principle that duty demanded commitment regardless of cost, and that commitment could achieve what calculation said was impossible. This principle had been embodied most completely by Commander Ernest Evans and USS Johnston. Evans' decision to attack immediately, alone, before coordinated action could be arranged, had set the template every other ship followed. His willingness to state explicitly that survival could not be expected had freed his crew from the psychological burden of hope they knew they would die, so they focused entirely on doing maximum damage before death arrived. That purity of focus, fighting without the distraction of survival, proved more effective than any tactical sophistication. Johnston's crew had not been trying to survive while fighting. They'd been fighting, period. The difference was subtle but profound. It showed in their rate of fire, their accuracy, their persistence in attacking even after catastrophic damage. They'd had nothing to lose because they'd already accepted the loss of everything. This acceptance terrified the Japanese because it was incomprehensible. Japanese naval doctrine included the concept of decisive battle, the willingness to risk entire fleets on a single engagement. But that was different from what they witnessed off Samar. The Americans hadn't risked their ships. They'd expended them, deliberately, as ammunition. The difference between risking and expending was the difference between gambling and sacrifice. The aftermath of the battle revealed the scope of this sacrifice in heartbreaking detail. The survivors of Johnston, Hole, and Samuel B. Roberts floated in oil-covered water for 2 to 3 days before rescue. The oil coated their skin, filled their mouths, blinded them. Men died from exposure, from wounds that would have been survivable with prompt treatment, from shark attacks, from drinking seawater in delirium. The rescue efforts were hampered by the ongoing battle and by the vast area over which survivors were scattered. Many groups of men were passed by ships that didn't see them. Some groups drifted for days, watching their number dwindle as men slipped beneath the surface one by one. Robert, Billy, the gunner's mate from Johnston who survived, described the experience in testimony that remains almost unbearable to read. The first day, we tried to stay together. We tied our life jackets together so we wouldn't drift apart. The second day, men started dying, not from wounds, just giving up. The third day, the sharks came. By the time the destroyer escort found us, we'd stopped counting who was left. Of Johnston's 141 survivors, several died after rescue from their wounds or from complications of exposure. The final death toll stood at 186 of 327 crew members, a casualty rate of 57%. Commander Evans' body was never recovered. The last confirmed sighting placed him in the water shortly after Johnston sank, alive but grievously wounded. He disappeared within an hour. Whether he drowned from his wounds, was taken by sharks, or simply gave up fighting to live, no one knows. The survivors believed he'd fought to the end and then let go, that having gotten his crew into the water, having completed his final duty, he'd simply stopped. The Medal of Honor citation, presented to Evans' widow in a ceremony at the White House in 1947, attempted to capture what he'd accomplished. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. When his ship was struck by enemy fire and disabled during the battle off Samar, Commander Evans refused medical treatment and continued to direct the ship's defense until she sank. His courage and determination in the face of overwhelming odds were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. The citation, necessarily brief, could not convey the full scope of what Evans had done. He hadn't simply fought bravely in a battle he found himself in. He'd created the battle, chosen to fight it, defined its terms, and forced every other ship, American and Japanese, to fight on those terms. His decision, made in seconds on the morning of October 25, 1944, had altered the tactical situation so completely that the strategic outcome of the entire later Gulf operation had hinged on it. The mathematical analysis conducted by the Naval War College in the years following the war confirmed this. Staff officers recreated the battle using the known capabilities of all ships involved, running the scenario multiple times with different American responses to Kurita's appearance. In scenarios where the destroyers maintained screening positions and relied on smoke and maneuver, Kurita's force closed to gunnery range and sank all 6 carriers within 90 minutes. In scenarios where the destroyers attacked in coordinated formation after planning, the results improved marginally. 1 or 2 carriers might escape, but the outcome remained catastrophic. Only in scenarios where at least 1 destroyer attacked immediately, disrupting Japanese formation, before coordinated pursuit could develop, did significant numbers of carriers survive. The analysis concluded that Johnston's solo attack, though tactically indefensible by conventional standards, had been strategically essential. This conclusion reshaped destroyer doctrine. The post-war Fletcher-class destroyer operating manual included a new section on independent immediate attack that used Johnston's action as the defining case study. The manual stated, "When enemy capital ships threaten friendly carriers or transports, the destroyer's duty is to attack immediately with all available weapons. Survival of the destroyer is not a consideration. Disruption of enemy formation and delay of enemy advance are the sole objectives. The willingness to accept certain destruction, visibly demonstrated, will often achieve greater effect than the physical damage inflicted." This was revolutionary doctrine. Pre-war destroyer tactics had emphasized coordination, mutual support, and preservation of force. The post-war doctrine explicitly stated that preservation of force was irrelevant when carriers or transports were threatened. The destroyer was ammunition, to be expended for effect. The human cost of this doctrine was never hidden. The same manual that instructed destroyer captains to accept certain destruction also required them to brief their crews on the implications. Destroyermen were to understand that their purpose was to die in place of more valuable ships, not to fight and maybe die, to die, period, but to die in a way that saved others. Remarkably, recruiting for destroyer service increased after the war. Young naval officers requested destroyer commands at rates higher than before Samar. When asked why, many cited Johnston's action specifically. They wanted to serve aboard ships where courage mattered, where individual initiative could alter strategic outcomes, where the equation was simple: your life for theirs, make the trade count. This ethos pervaded the destroyer force for decades. Ships carried informal mottos like expendable but effective and last line, first fight. Ready rooms displayed photos of Johnston with captions like "She did her job" and "This is what we are." The message was consistent. Destroyers were not expected to survive, only to fight effectively before dying. But there was another legacy, less tangible but equally important. The Battle off Samar demonstrated that warfare's outcome was not determined solely by material factors. The Japanese had possessed superior firepower, superior armor, superior numbers. They should have won decisively. They'd lost because the Americans had demonstrated a level of commitment that altered the psychological dimension of combat. Kurita's decision to withdraw was not based primarily on the physical damage his ships had sustained. Though several cruisers had been torpedoed, none of his battleships were seriously damaged. His decision was based on the conclusion that an enemy, fighting with such disregard for survival, must be protecting something of immense value, and continuing the attack would lead him into a prepared ambush. He was wrong. There was no ambush. There was only the value the Americans placed on their mission and their willingness to pay any price to accomplish it. But that willingness, convincingly demonstrated, had proven more effective than any material force. This realization that the willingness to die, properly employed, could achieve strategic effect became a subject of intense study in military academies worldwide. The Battle off Samar appeared in curricula not as an example of tactics or technology, but as a demonstration of how moral factors could overcome material disadvantages. The study of the battle also revealed uncomfortable truths about the relationship between command authority and individual sacrifice. Evans had ordered his crew into certain death. He'd stated it explicitly. Yet his crew had followed his orders, fought with extraordinary effectiveness, and died in large numbers. Was this leadership or murder? Did a commander have the right to expend his men's lives this way? The question was debated in ethics courses at Annapolis and other naval academies for decades. The arguments on both sides were compelling. On one hand, Evans had sacrificed his crew for a clear military purpose protecting the carriers and had shared their fate, dying alongside them. On the other hand, he'd made the decision to attack without consulting them, committing them to death without their explicit consent. The survivors provided the moral resolution. In interview after interview, when asked if Evans had the right to order them into a battle he knew they'd lose, they responded consistently, yes. He'd been their commander. The situation had demanded action. They'd volunteered for naval service knowing that combat was possible. Evans had done what the situation required, and they'd done their duty. Johnston's gunnery officer who survived put it most clearly in a 1985 interview. Commander Evans didn't sacrifice us, we sacrificed ourselves. He gave the order, but we executed it. Every man on that ship could have refused, could have said, this is suicide, I'm not doing it. We knew the trade, our lives for those carriers and the men aboard them. We made the trade, and we'd make it again. This acceptance that military service included the possibility of ordered death, and that such orders could be legitimate when the cause was clear, provided the ethical foundation for post-war destroyer doctrine. But it also imposed obligations on commanders. If you had the authority to order men to certain death, you had the obligation to ensure the deaths achieved meaningful purpose and to share the fate you ordered for them. Evans had met both obligations. Johnston's attack had been essential to Taffy 3's survival post-war. Analysis confirmed this. And Evans had died with his ship, refusing to save himself, while his crew perished. The combination of tactical necessity and personal sacrifice provided the moral justification for what he'd ordered. But not every commander could meet that standard. Post-war destroyer commanders lived with the knowledge that someday they might face the decision Evans had faced. Attack knowing your crew will die, or withdraw, knowing the ships you're protecting will die instead. And if you chose to attack, you had to be prepared to die alongside the men whose deaths you ordered. This burden, the knowledge that command authority included the authority to order death, and that using that authority required sharing that death, shaped the character of the Destroyer Force Officer Corps. Men who commanded destroyers in the decades after Samar carried with them the example of Ernest Evans. Attack immediately. Accept no excuses. Share your crew's fate. The legacy extended beyond the destroyer force to the wider Navy and to military service generally. The Battle off Samar became a touchstone for discussions about duty, sacrifice, and the proper relationship between individual life and mission accomplishment. The central question, how far can duty require us to go, found its answer in what Johnston's crew had done. Duty could require everything. Not required, could require. And when it did, the correct response was to give everything without hesitation or complaint. This is hard teaching. Modern sensibilities often recoil from it. The idea that human life can be deliberately expended for tactical advantage seems barbaric. Yet the alternative, refusing to expend lives even when doing so, would save more lives, leads to different moral hazards. If Johnston had not attacked, if Evans had preserved his ship and crew by maintaining his screening position, Kurita's force would have destroyed the carriers. The 6 carriers held over 7,000 men. Johnston held 327. The arithmetic was brutal but clear. Evans had made the calculation and accepted its implications. 186 of his crew had died, so that 7,000 men on the carriers might live. The trade was strategically sound, but it required someone willing to make it, and Evans had been that person. The final legacy of USS Johnston and Commander Evans is preserved in the destroyer force to this day. Every Fletcher-class destroyer that survived the war and remained in service carried a plaque in the wardroom, listing the ships lost in action. Johnston's name appears on that list, along with the date October 25, 1944, and a simple inscription, "She attacked." Not, "She fought bravely," or "She defended courageously." Just, "She attacked." That inscription captures the essential truth. Johnston had not fought defensively, or manoeuvred skillfully, or survived through luck. She'd attacked, immediately and aggressively, accepting certain destruction to accomplish her mission. Everything else, the courage, the skill, the sacrifice, flowed from that decision to attack. The wreck of Johnston was discovered in October 2019 by the research vessel Petrel, lying in 21,000 feet of water off Samar. The expedition, led by Victor Vescovo, located the destroyer's remains on the ocean floor, deeper than any previously discovered shipwreck. The wreck sits upright, her bow pointed toward the last position of the Japanese fleet she'd attacked 75 years earlier. Photographs from the expedition show Johnston's hull remarkably well preserved. Her forward 5-inch gun mount remains trained to starboard, frozen in firing position. Her bridge collapsed, crushed by the 14-inch shell that killed Evans and his command staff. The torpedo mounts are empty, all 10 torpedoes had been fired before she sank. Her battle flag, though deteriorated, still flies from the mast. The discovery brought renewed attention to the Battle off Samar and Johnston's role. News coverage emphasized the destroyer's sacrifice and Evans' leadership. But for the survivors, fewer than a dozen still alive in 2019, the discovery meant something different. It meant their ship, and their shipmates who'd gone down with her, had been found and remembered. Robert Billy, one of the last surviving crew members, released a statement through his family. "Johnston is exactly where she should be, pointed toward the enemy, guns still manned, flag still flying. That's how we remember her. That's how she should be remembered. She attacked, she fought, she went down fighting. What more can you ask of a warship? What more?" Indeed. In the end, the story of USS Johnston and Commander Ernest Evans is not primarily about tactics or technology or strategic outcomes. It's about the human capacity for commitment, about the willingness to do what duty requires even when duty requires death, about the decision to attack when every logical calculation says to withdraw, because attack is your purpose and you refuse to fail in your purpose. This capacity to commit completely, to accept annihilation, to choose duty over survival, appears rarely in human affairs. When it does appear, it achieves effects beyond what material analysis predicts. Kurita's withdrawal, the survival of Taffy 3, the protection of the later landings all flowed from decisions made by individual men to commit themselves fully to their duty. Commander Ernest Evans made that commitment on Johnston's Bridge on the morning of October 25, 1944, when he ordered his destroyer to attack 4 battleships. His crew made that commitment when they followed his order without hesitation. 186 of them died fulfilling that commitment. But their deaths purchased time, and that time saved thousands of lives and altered the course of the Pacific War. The price was terrible. The necessity was undeniable. The commitment was absolute. That's the legacy of USS Johnston, not that she fought well or defended skillfully, but that when the moment came requiring complete commitment regardless of cost, she and her crew provided that commitment without reservation or regret. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.